Before empires rose and heroes fell, and before gods turned their faces from mankind, there was a woman whose beauty could spark 1,000 ships to war. When they say beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, all eyes behold this beauty. She was the daughter of the supreme god Zeus, born of divine and mortal blood. A queen of Sparta, promised to a king, but destined for a love that would ignite the greatest conflict that the world had ever known during that time. Her name? Helen, henceforth known as Helen of Troy. Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video. This video is inspired by my previous video about Sparta. I mentioned a part of this story briefly, but this story deserves a video of its own, so here it is. So I would suggest that you first watch the video about Sparta if you want to see both of them, and then come back to this video. I also have a video about a few of the survivors of Troy, and I mentioned them in my video about the birth of Rome, so you could also watch that one if you like. So the subject for this video is of course Helen of Troy. But even though history knows her as Helen of Troy, she was actually married to King Menelaus of Sparta, so therefore she was named Helen of Sparta. But why is she more often associated with Troy than with Sparta? Well, it's all because of her role in the Trojan War. Because if not for her existence and her immense beauty, there wouldn't be a war to begin with. But could you blame a war on something that someone was born with? Isn't the blame with the goddesses who were angered by an apple? Or perhaps you could blame Prince Paris, who decided to steal Helen away from her husband and thereby seal the fate of the Trojans. Was Helen a willing accomplice or just a pawn of the gods? Or perhaps the most beautiful curse ever unleashed upon the earth? In this video I will tell you the story of Helen of Troy. I will tell you all the different variations. I will tell you about her importance even till this day and how she's seen throughout the years. So I say once again, Pame Mazimu, which means come with me. Let's start at the very beginning. Fun fact, Helen is not even called Helen in Greek, she's called Eleni, which could come from the word moon, which is Selene, or from the word Eleni, which means torch. But for this video we will use her English name Helen. There are many sources when it comes to the mythological story of Helen of Troy. So there are also a lot of different stories about her origin. But for this video I will mainly use the stories that were written down in the Iliad and the Odyssey, because most people know them. And sometimes I will also mention other stories. So Helen was the daughter of the supreme god Zeus and of the mortal queen Leda. And she was the wife of the Spartan king Tyndareus. Use your imagination for this story because you're gonna need it. Zeus was known as a womanizer and didn't mind cheating on his wife, the goddess Hera. He also loved to disguise himself when he visited Earth, and most of the time he decided to go to Earth as an eagle, which was his animal sidekick, you can say, or the symbol of Zeus, but he didn't shy away to try other animal forms. And in this case he decided to come to Earth as the majestic swan. But not even the gods were safe for their natural predators. He was chased by his own symbol, an eagle. He sought refuge and he stumbled upon Queen Leda. She was very kind and she felt sorry for the swan, so she decided to keep him safe. But what she didn't know was that the swan was Zeus in disguise. If she had known that, she would never have allowed him to come near her. You see, this was not the first time that she had encountered the supreme god Zeus. He wanted to lay with her several times, but she rejected him every single time. But now that he was close to her, he was finally able to gain her affection. He was able to mate with her. And after that he revealed his identity to Leda. This brought her to shame. She was heartbroken and she didn't want to hurt her husband. But since she felt sorry and heartbroken, she decided to lay with her husband on the same night. What she didn't expect was that she wasn't becoming pregnant the way she was anticipating, because Zeus came to her as a swan, so therefore she laid 2 eggs. In some stories they claim that she laid 1 egg, but for this story we will stay with 2 eggs. And she also became pregnant by her own husband. So 9 months later the eggs hatched, and she also gave birth to Castor and Clytemnestra. From the eggs came Pollux and the most beautiful baby they had ever seen in all of Greece, and they named her Helen. Some stories claim that Castor came from the egg and that Pollux was the son of Tyndareus. Either way, they were all raised in the Spartan palace and they would all play a big part in the Greek mythology. And even as a young girl, nobody could deny the beauty of Helen. She had many admirers from a young age. But as I already mentioned, she was still young, and unlike other Greek city-states, Spartans didn't want their young girls to get married at a young age and get pregnant and in most cases die of childbirth or have many complications that would make them very unhealthy. Therefore, Helen was allowed to be a child. She could enjoy the countryside and she could play in the palace gardens with her sister and 2 brothers. Some stories even claim that her brothers also taught her how to use a bow, how to ride a horse, and how to hunt. Her life was very pleasant and cheerful. But it wouldn't take long before she would be abducted for the very first time. And in this case, it wasn't by Prince Paris, but by another Greek hero. 2 Athenians would soon take Helen away from her palace in Sparta. And they were none other than 2 well-known mythological heroes named Theseus and Pirithous, sons of Poseidon and Zeus and best friends to each other. One day they decided that they both should have divine wives because they were the sons of gods. Pirithous chose to marry Persephone, the daughter of his father Zeus and the goddess Demeter, and also the wife of his uncle Hades, who was the god of the underworld. He was reaching very high, if you ask me, or I could better say he was reaching very low because she was living in the underworld with Hades. Theseus decided to go for Helen, who was probably around 7 or 10 years old during that time. They agreed to help each other to fetch them, and they started with Helen, which was of course the easiest target because she was still very young. They abducted her from her Spartan home and they brought her to Theseus' mother Aethra, and after that they traveled to the underworld to fetch Persephone. Of course, this would be the harder task. Hades, the god of the underworld, was no fool. He knew that something was up, so he decided to pretend to be a great host to his 2 nephews. And ignorant as they were, they accepted it. When they sat down, snakes appeared and coiled around their feet. But luckily for them, they were sons of gods, so Hades decided to set them free. When they returned to Athens, they saw that it was invaded. Castor and Pollux came with an army to retrieve their sister. I wonder how they did it, because as far as I can remember, they were born at the same time as Helen and she was 7 or 10 years old. But hey, it's Greek mythology, so we're just gonna ignore that fact. They had captured Theseus' mother Aethra in revenge and they returned their sister to Sparta. Some stories claim that Theseus gave Helen a daughter, but most of the stories deny this fact. So I will deny this as well. I wonder why they call Theseus a hero, because after this event, I'm not sure anymore. Anyway, back to Sparta. Helen grew up to be a beautiful woman. And eventually she reached an age where her parents decided that it was time to find suitors for Helen to wed. This news was spreading like wildfire, and before the king and queen of Sparta knew it, their harbor of Gythia was filled with princes, kings, and even other people who wanted to marry Helen. They offered rich gifts to persuade the king to promise Helen to them. But not only the king was involved in dealing with the suitors. Helen's brothers Castor and Pollux also had a very prominent role in deciding who would marry their sister. But the final decision would be in the hands of King Tyndareus. It was not an easy task to choose a suitor, because Tyndareus was afraid that he would offend the ones who he had sent away. He didn't want to have a quarrel with them, because that could lead to an unnecessary war. But luckily for him, one suitor was known to be very cunning, and he would help him with that problem. He was a well-known figure from Greek mythology, and his name was Odysseus. And he was not even wealthy by all means, because he didn't even bring gifts with him. In fact, Odysseus even thought that his chances were very slim. And in all actuality, Odysseus was far more interested in another woman. And she was the daughter of another Spartan king, who was named Icarius, and her name was Penelope. If the king would support him in his courting of Penelope, he would solve the problem that the king had with the suitors. Tyndareus agreed, and he was very curious what Odysseus was planning to do with the suitors. Odysseus gathered all the suitors together and made them swear a solemn oath before they could be considered as husbands to Helen. He made them swear to defend the chosen husband against whoever should quarrel with him. All the suitors, eager to have a chance with Helen, swore the oath. This eased Tyndareus, and he was finally able to choose a suitor to marry his daughter Helen. He decided to choose Menelaus, who was represented by his brother Agamemnon, who came from Mycenae. He chose him for his wealth. And the pact was sealed by offering a horse. Not long after this all, Tyndareus and his wife Leda decided to abdicate from the throne and gave the throne to Helen and her new husband Menelaus. And Menelaus was the luckiest man alive. He won the greatest prize there was to be won, the most beautiful woman in the entire world, and he could call her his wife. And luckily for Helen, her life with Menelaus was very pleasant. They liked each other and they were ruling Sparta together as king and queen. They got at least one daughter together and they named her Hermione. And no, she wasn't a witch, even though there were witches in ancient Greece, but she was the princess of Sparta. Some sources claim that Menelaus and Helen had two other children, two sons to be exact, and their names were Nicostratus and Pleitoris. But in some stories they claim that they were only the sons of Menelaus and they had them with two slaves. So I will once again reject this story. So in my story they only have their daughter Hermione. And Helen and Menelaus ruled Sparta for at least 10 years. And it was a very prosperous and peaceful time. If only they'd known that their marriage and the pact the suitors made would mark the beginning of the end of the age of heroes. Zeus wanted to obliterate the race of men and the heroes in particular. Luckily for him, he didn't have to do it all by himself. Ares, the goddess of discord, would unknowingly help him with his plan. And an apple would once again be a catalyst in this story. If we want to know what happens next, we need to go to another part of Greece. There was a wedding. And this was not a normal wedding. It was the wedding of the parents of the not yet born Achilles. In honor of their wedding, Zeus organized a banquet on Mount Olympus. He invited every deity or demigod, but he forgot, or perhaps he decided not to invite Ares. Ares was very hurt and she decided to get some revenge. She threw an apple, now known as the Apple of Discord, into the banquet, inscribed to the fairest one. 3 of the goddesses who attended the wedding were all sure that it was meant for them. They were Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. They started a quarrel but eventually decided to ask Zeus to choose one of them. Even though Hera was his own wife, he knew that choosing either one of them would cause a hatred towards him. He declined their request and he chose a mortal instead, and his eye fell on Paris, the herder who unknowingly was a prince of Troy. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, escorted the three goddesses to the earth to a place called Mount Ida. They stopped at a spring and they decided to bathe there. They bathed there until Paris arrived with his cattle. He of course didn't know anything about this and he was shocked to see these goddesses bathing in the spring. He was very frightened by their appearance because they were of course immortal, beautiful women, but Hermes was able to calm him down. He told him that Zeus had chosen him for this special task. Of course, all three the goddesses tried to look their absolute best so that Paris would give the apple to them. But it was no easy task for Paris because they all looked amazing and awe-inspiring. He couldn't decide either, so the goddesses had to be clever once again. And they decided to bribe him into choosing the most beautiful goddess. Hera, the wife of Zeus, promised him ownership of all of Europe and Asia. He would be the most powerful man in all of Greece and beyond. Athena offered him skill in battle, wisdom, and the abilities of the greatest warriors. This would make him the strongest and unbeatable man of the world. Aphrodite promised him the love of the most beautiful woman on earth, who of course was Helen of Sparta. Men are known to be weakened by women, so it was no surprise that Paris decided to go for the most beautiful woman in all of the world. Therefore, he gave the apple to Aphrodite, and this of course angered the other two goddesses. Aphrodite of course was very happy that she won, and she promised Paris to give him what he wanted. But there was one problem. Helen was already married. Before we go back to Helen in Sparta, there's one thing that you should know. Paris had always believed that he was the son of a shepherd. But then he discovered that he was the lost prince of Troy. He returned to Troy and he was welcomed back by his family. If I want to tell this story, I should make a whole video about it, so this is the most you can get for now. Of course, Paris did not forget his promised wife when he returned to Troy, even though she was married and he was also married himself. So Paris convinced his parents that he had to go on a diplomatic mission to King Menelaus in Sparta. He took his fleet and escort with him and they sailed from Troy to Sparta. Aphrodite protected him and guided him to make sure that this mission would succeed. When Paris arrived in Sparta, he was greeted by Menelaus as was Greek custom. He was invited inside the palace as a friend and ally. Paris of course was only busy looking around if he could see Helen anywhere, but she was still inside her chambers. When it was finally time for the welcoming feast, Helen showed herself. She came downstairs together with her daughter Hermione. Paris had never seen something so beautiful in his entire life. He was lost for words. Their eyes crossed each other when Menelaus introduced Helen to their honored guest, and she also felt struck by lightning. Perhaps it was Aphrodite who ordered her son Ares to hit her with his arrow, or it was true love. Either way, Helen and Paris only had eyes for each other. A few days had passed and Menelaus had to leave Sparta to sail to Crete, most likely for a funeral. This was the perfect chance for Paris to take Helen with him to Troy. And stories differ if she was taken by seduction or abduction, but either way he took her with him and his whole fleet to go back to Troy. When the news reached Menelaus, he was of course furious. He believed that Helen was taken and he was not going to let it slide. He remembered the oath that the suitors had taken in front of his father-in-law, King Tyndareus, and he decided to call them all to help him invade Troy and get Helen back. And heroes from all across Greece came to his aid. Back to Troy, when Paris returned home and the family saw that he had Helen of Sparta with him, they were not happy at first. They were afraid that this would mean something bad. But eventually they decided to welcome her with open arms. Paris' brother, Hector, who was also the heir of the throne of Troy, was very afraid that this would cause a war. And of course he was right. He was a hero renowned among all the Trojans, so if anyone was wise, he was the one. I won't discuss all the events that happened during the Trojan War because once again it deserves a video of its own. But war was ineffable. Helen lived in luxury as a Trojan princess, and even when men were the ones that started the war, Troy hated Helen. She had never asked for this, unless of course she willingly went with Paris to Troy, which most of the stories dispute. If we have to blame someone, it could be Odysseus, who suggested the oath of loyalty. Or we could blame the goddesses for their vanity. But everyone is responsible for their own actions, even with the gods involved. The portraits of Helen in Troy contradict each other. Some stories claim that she was treacherous and that she rejoiced every Trojan casualty. Other stories claim that she was sad, desperate and lonely and that she wanted to escape from her prison. And there's of course the story of a lovesick Helen who was welcomed by the family in Troy and was seen as one of their own. If it's up to me, I prefer the helpless Helen above all the others. But most of the adaptations, either on TV or in books, portray her as a woman who fell in love with Paris, either by choice or by a spell from Aphrodite. Eventually, the Trojan War would end after around 10 years. The Trojan horse would signal the end of the war. The Trojans thought that it was a gift and they decided to bring it into the city. But what they didn't know was that Greek soldiers were hidden inside the Trojan horse and that they would come out at night. They opened the gates of Troy from the inside and they let the Greek army in. They set everything ablaze and they destroyed the city of Troy. The great city of Troy had finally fallen. What about Paris? Well, he didn't see the end of the Trojan War. Paris did not survive the Trojan War. Paris most likely died before the Trojan War ended, but not long before that. He was killed by Philoctetes, who had been left on the island of Lemnos years earlier, but returned with Heracles' magic bow and arrows. It was prophesied to be crucial to Troy's defeat. At first, Paris was only wounded by an arrow of Philoctetes, so he sought help from his former lover, the nymph Oenone. She refused to help him because she was angry that he had abandoned her for Helen. She did change her mind eventually, but it was too late. He had already died of his wounds. Oenone was struck by grief and decided to take her own life to join him. When Troy fell, Menelaus stormed inside the palace to look for Helen. He found her, of course, without Paris by her side. There are once again many different versions of when Menelaus and Helen were reunited. In one story, Menelaus found Helen heartbroken and crying because she knew that Paris had died and that she was truly lost now. Menelaus raised his sword to kill Helen. He was of course the one with the unfaithful wife, so he decided that he should be the one to end her life. But when he raised his arm to strike, she dropped her robe from her shoulder. Her beauty, even after 10 long years, was still breathtaking. He dropped the sword from his hand and he took her back to Sparta. In other stories, she was happy to see him and she wailed in his arms. They were finally reunited and Menelaus forgives her for coming with Paris to Troy. They returned to Sparta, and when they returned, they continued to be the king and queen of Sparta. And of course Helen became the mother she always wanted to be for Hermione. They lived a peaceful life until death, without grudges and without sorrow. And there are also other stories about Helen's eventual fate. There is a story that she was saved by Apollo from Orestes, who took her to Mount Olympus. Menelaus did not even see her anymore, She was made a sea goddess alongside her two brothers Castor and Pollux, and together they would watch over sailors. There are also very rare versions where they claim that Helen did not even go to Troy at all, but that she was taken to Egypt, and that a phantom double would go to Troy instead. So Paris was with a phantom double, and Helen waited out the war in Egypt to return to Sparta after it ended. There's also a story where the female survivors of Troy take Helen back to Greece to face a death sentence for her betrayal of Greece. Another story by Pausanias claims that Helen had to flee Sparta after her husband had died. She decided to go to the island of Rhodes, where she had a friend named Polyxo, who was also the Queen of Rhodes. They say that Polyxo desired to avenge the death of her husband Tlepolemus, who died during the Trojan War. And since Helen thought that they were friends, it would be easy. Her handmaiden seized Helen when she was bathing and hanged her on a tree. And for this reason, the Rhodians have a sanctuary named Helen of the Tree. And I've been to Rhodes, I think 3 times now, and for longer periods of time. But I have never heard this story or seen a sanctuary that's called Helen of the Tree. So even though this story is mythological, I don't believe this one. But the most well-known source is of course Homer, who wrote about the Trojan War in his book The Iliad. She's also mentioned in his other book, The Odyssey, Book 4, where she welcomes Odysseus' son Telemachus when he's looking for answers about his father's disappearance. In this story, she talks a bit about her time in Troy. She states, "The gods drove me to it, otherwise I would never have left my husband." And this leads me to my other question. Did Helen want to come with Paris to Troy? If we believe the last statement, she said that the gods forced her to. But Homer portrays her a little bit different in his Iliad Book 3, where she states to King Priam of Troy, "I wish I had died before I followed your son, far from my home, my husband and my child," which indicates that she blames herself in a way. It seems she regrets her decision, feels guilt and expresses homesickness. But Homer leaves room for interpretation, because she doesn't always blame Paris directly. And of course you have the stories where she willingly goes, because she's in love and she can't imagine a life without Paris by her side. And I think that most people prefer this version, because there is a reason why we still call her Helen of Troy instead of Helen of Sparta, while she never married into the Trojan family. So basically we can't answer this question because there are so many versions and interpretation of the story. The only thing that we can say for certain is that Helen would probably have never left her husband Menelaus if it wasn't for the whole apple incident. But why do we have so many different versions of Helen's story? I have several answers to that question. But the most logical one is of course different authors with different goals. Homer wanted to have an epic, heroic story, so therefore Helen had to be tragic and complex. You can question her, but you can also understand her, which makes her a very interesting character in a story that's filled with heroic men. It shows how a woman can make a man do idiotic things. Euripides was known for criticizing war and human folly, so he made Helen completely innocent in some of his plays. Poor Helen was a victim of the gods and of the male gaze. Time has also changed the view on Helen. Early on, it was easy to portray Helen as a seductress. Men could not do anything wrong. Women were just trying to lure men in with their beauty and cause their downfall. Later, especially in Athens, people thought more about fate and divine manipulation. Helen was seen as a victim of the gods, and this would make the citizens fearful of the gods and their games and would make them more faithful towards the religion. Helen was also an example in politics. She was an example of how something very small can cause something enormous like a war. So small actions can have big consequences. In medieval times, Helen was a symbol of sin or a justification for violence. Her beauty would cause moral downfall. So men should stay away from temptations, and especially the temptations of the flesh. But her abduction justified wars. Men should defend what is theirs. In the less advanced parts of Europe, she was seen as a ghost, witch or immortal. Nowadays, Helen is more seen as a woman who is blamed for the actions of men. She was a victim and a pawn. Female empowerment is going strong these days, with Helen as one of their faces. But of course, she's also still associated with beauty and grace, and if somebody calls you as beautiful as Helen, it's because of her. Such a beautiful woman as Helen, with such an amazing story, had to become a big subject for artwork and other artistic projects. So there are, of course, countless works of art throughout history with her as the subject. I've already shown some of them during this video. The drama of the Trojan War and the beauty of Helen asks for beautiful artwork. There are Greek potteries and frescoes especially about her abduction. There is Renaissance and neoclassical art that shows romantic paintings of Helen. And Hollywood also showed Helen in complex and sometimes even feminist lights as a symbol of objectification, or as a powerful figure caught in the chaos of war. There are even songs written about her, and most of the time they are defending her role in the Trojan War. And they are sung by women. And I'm sure that many future artists will also use this subject and Helen's beauty for their own art projects. And this will happen for many, many years to come, because her story will never be forgotten. Unless the world goes down and all the books burn. But let's hope that never happens. So in conclusion, many stories of Helen of Troy have been written down, told, or even painted, with the most prominent one being the one that Homer wrote. But was Helen a real person? I think it's safe to say that she wasn't. She's more of a symbol of beauty and grace, or everything that I mentioned before. So she could be a symbol for the politics, she could be a symbol for the religions, whatever suits your agenda. Or perhaps she was a warning of the danger of beauty and pride. Helen's story reflects themes of love, beauty, power, and consequence. And her story remains one of the most enduring in classical mythology. Helen's name will also endure, unlike the great city of Troy. And not for her actions or what she did, but for what she symbolizes. Love, war, and the power of myth. This was my video about Helen of Troy. I really hope you liked it. It was a very long one, at least. I took a lot of time to film it, so perhaps it's shorter when I edit it. But I really enjoyed talking about this subject, and I really hope that you enjoyed it as well. For my next video, you can suggest whatever you like. I have one video that I already chose the subject for. But if you know anything else, please put it in the comment section and perhaps I'll make a video about it. What can I say more? Well, thank you for watching. If you like it, give a thumbs up. If you like it even more, comment under this video or subscribe. That would help me a lot. And I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!